Hello everybody, welcome to the Coopersmith Career Consulting Study Guide or Crash Course on Comparative Politics. This is going to be a course in which we are going to look at governments, how they operate, how they were formed, and we're also going to take a look at some specific governments as we move along. And as you can see over here, this is just kind of a summary of the course. I'm not going to belabor it too much, but we're going to look at governments on a global level, and then we are going to look at governments on a specific local level, how they function in various countries. The assessment is based on one final exam. It will be a combination of multiple choice and essay questions. You can see over here what the course objectives are. Again, we're not going to really worry too much about that because we're going to cover all of these in the material itself. But we're going to look at political cultures, how politics operate in various countries, how they work. It's actually a very interesting study. Let's take a look at some issues in comparative politics. Just to give you a little bit of an introduction, there are some people that will tell you that all war is politics and force, just a combination of those two things, where people try to force their politics on other people. Politics is everything to do with government. Everything that a government is about, everything that is established by a government is really all about politics. The decisions are social, which means about people's relationship with each other, public, which of course means relevant to all the people in the society, and authoritative means with the authority to make rules. Politics are done by the public in an atmosphere that deals with people in their relationship with other people, and by definition they have to be authoritative, which means there has to be rule-making authority. If the person who's making the rule doesn't have the authority to carry out the rule, well then the rule's kind of pointless. If I sit around and I say, well, the rule's XYZ, but I can't actually enforce the rule, then frankly, who cares? The core of politics, of course, is decision-making. Whenever Congress passes a law, or doesn't pass the law, as is usually the case nowadays, that is, of course, a decision-making. They're making a decision one way or the other, what kind of law to pass, whether to enforce the law, how to enforce the law, etc. And these decisions have to be binding on the political system, which means on the system of government that applies in that country. Once again, if they're not binding, if it doesn't actually affect anybody, well, then the whole thing is kind of pointless. A government is a group of people or an organization, a ruling organization, it could even be one person if that government is a king, that the people appoint or that the people vest with authority to rule the society. So governments have the power to make binding decisions on behalf of a community. If people would not have governments, you'd have what is called anarchy, which literally means no ruler. And so the state of nature is what humankind would be if no government existed, which would be pretty much empty and lawlessness, and people would pretty much do whatever they want. Throughout history, there have been various philosophers who have determined or what they think would happen if there were no government. Some of the most famous ones over here, Thomas Hobbes was the famous social contract person who essentially said that if there would be no government, people would kill each other and maim each other and steal from each other, and that wouldn't be good, and therefore we need government and authority. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Frenchman, he actually was more of a free person thinker. He was more like an anarchist, although even he agreed that without government, that government benefits people to some extent, but Rousseau was actually a philosopher who was of the belief that people should basically be free in their natural state. We don't really follow either one of these two. The one that we really do follow here in the United States is the John Locke philosophy. The John Locke philosophy is that there should be a limited government. There should be a government to protect people and to enforce law and order, because we need some form of authority, but also we should protect people's rights. The Lockean idea is majority rules. The majority of people say what the rules are, but minority rights. People who disagree at least have their basic rights, things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, etc., etc., etc. And one of the reasons why a government is necessary is because when you're building a community, which is really just a group of people, things are going to happen that cause conflict. For example, conflicts between different types of people are almost inevitable. People sometimes have a common identity, like a certain race or color, a certain language they speak, historical roots, religion, nationality, and when you have different people in society that have different physical traits, different languages, different histories, different religions, different nationalities, they naturally might clash a little bit. And so certainly that's one reason why a government is necessary. Here are some other things that governments are relevant to. Number one is the economy, and the economy is measured in something called GDP, or gross domestic product. That means the overall output of your economy. For example, if you measured all of the production of all of the workers, whether they be people that work in factories producing cars, or waiters who work in restaurants, or college professors who teach, if you took all the economic value of all the activity of all the people in the country and you added it together, it's not easy to measure, but there are economists that measure these things, you'd get the GDP, you'd get the gross domestic product. One of the most important ways in which countries' economies are measured is through this GDP. The theory is that the higher a nation's GDP, the healthier the economy is. Now you can see this little caveat over here that a large GDP can conceal significant differences in distribution. For example, if you had one person who produced $1 million worth of wealth and another person who produced $1 worth of wealth, well, together they'd have a GDP of $1,001 for two people, which is very high. But on the other hand, it's also not so good because you have wealth disparity. So certainly it's good to have a high GDP, but it's also good to have relative equality between people. You don't want the rich people being super duper rich and the poor people being super duper poor. That is not a good long-term strategy. So that's gross domestic product. Other things that a government has to control are public goods. In other words, things that are not owned by any one individual. Examples of public goods include things like clean air, which obviously is not owned by anybody, but the government should strive to maintain clean air for everybody. Police, national defense, which means the army, public parks, these are all things that a government has to maintain, even though they don't belong to any one individual. Of course, there are other things that are owned by individuals, like food, homes, books. Those things the government role is a little bit more limited in. The government, for example, might have a role in food, like the Food and Drug Administration, to make sure things are safe, but on the other hand, they're not going to completely run the distribution of all food in all homes throughout the entire country. Things like the police, on the other hand, are almost entirely government-owned. And finally, for this first chapter over here, we have some definitions over here. I'm sorry if this is a little small. I'll make it a little bit bigger over here. Nations and states. A nation, even though we sometimes use nation and country as being interchangeable, a nation means a group of people with a common identity. For example, you could have the United States of America and we call it one nation under God in the Pledge of Allegiance, but by this definition it isn't really one nation. By this definition, for example, let's say the American Indians from a particular tribe might be considered a nation, or all the people of British descent who live in the Northeast might be considered a nation. A group of people with a common identity. A country is made up of many different nations, usually, and one nation can be spread apart over many countries. A state, on the other hand, is really what we think of as a country, a type of political system. It has its own independent legal authority, which means that it can make laws within its own borders. It is molded by domestic and international environments, which means within itself and other organizations and other countries from the outside have influence on it. And it also, of course, has limits or constraints on external, which means outside its borders, and internal, within its borders, sovereignty, which means rulership. In other words, a state has rules within its borders, but those are limited. They can't rule and do anything they want without and within their borders. A multinational state, which is virtually every country on Earth, is a state that consists of many different nations. Sometimes the nations within the country, in other words, the groups of people within the country, are so far apart that they split apart into other countries. The Soviet Union split apart into 14 republics. Yugoslavia split apart into, I think, 6 or 7 different countries. What is it? Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Croatia, Macedonia and a few others, whatever. Czechoslovakia, which was split apart into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and they have broken apart. There, in terms of types of states, you have authoritarian states, which basically means you have governments that are not responsible to the people, governments with dictators or kings that don't get elected and they don't really have an interest in caring what the people think. Then you have democratic states, which promote civil rights and liberties, in other words, which do afford freedom to its citizens. You have fascist states, which are states that rule draconianly over its own people, and then you have totalitarian states, which are dictatorships, which again is another type of country, another type of government that does not answer to the people, where we have an individual or a small group of people that rule the state and don't derive their authority from the people in the country. Our next chapter is about comparing political systems. This includes describing political systems, explaining, even predicting what will happen to various political systems, and building theories as to what could happen in various political systems, how well they will function. So let's start with some vocabulary over here. A system is interdependent parts acting within a government. You can have a government with many different components. For example, in the United States, you have Congress, which is one part, which makes the rules. You have the president, who enforces the rules. You have the courts, who decide cases. You have the administrative agencies, which deal with things like transportation, food and drugs, things like that. And they all work together within a governmental system, which is what we have. A political system is a set of institutions, a set of organizations that are concerned with formulating, which means making up, and implementing, which means making sure that they happen, these collective goals. So institutions of the United States might be the Supreme Court, Congress, the presidency, the cabinet, and various other groups within the government and within the political system. You also have other components of the political system that include government workers. For example, the Social Security Administration, the Department of Justice, the Transportation Safety Administration. As you know, if you fly anywhere, you know what they're like. And the government themselves, namely Congress and the President, are the parts of that political system that make the policies. But the system itself includes everybody who is part of the huge government apparatus. Political systems exist in international environments, in other words, in ways in which countries deal with each other, and in domestic environments, which are ways in which countries deal with their own people and with the people within their own borders. Some international example of political systems and how they work include exchanges among countries. For example, countries might make deals with each other to exchange goods, ideas, services, military alliances, whatever. Interdependence, countries sometimes rely on each other for trade, for ideas, for immigration, for law enforcement support, things like that. And of course, globalization. Globalization is the idea of companies, businesses, and economies becoming increasingly dependent on each other. For example, in China, where they make a lot of goods that are used in the United States, if a company outsources its manufacturing, which means starts doing its manufacturing in a factory in China, that would be considered globalization. You also, of course, have the political systems in the domestic arena, which means within the country. You have economic and political systems that are run within the country. You have political culture. For example, in the United States, the political culture is the conservatives against the liberals, the Democrats against the Republicans. Different countries have different types of political cultures. And of course, comparing politics or evaluation of politics between different political systems is very difficult, and because they might emphasize different different things. For example, if you're looking at the conservative Republicans in the United States and you tried to compare them with the Conservative Party in England, certainly there would be a lot different. Conservatives in England probably care about different things than conservatives in the United States. Conservatives in England might care about things like economic conservatism and not having smaller government, whereas conservatives in the United States might be more worried about social issues. So political systems are something that's hard to compare between countries, but of course we are going to try to do so anyway. And the way we're going to try to do that is by evaluating and comparing. So let's take a look over here at evaluating different political systems. Well, comparisons between political systems are done scientifically, just like you would look to see whether a drug works. You could also use the scientific hypotheses and the scientific method and analysis to determine whether a political system works. How do you do that? Well, of course, first you have to describe how the political system works. The easier the set of concepts is to understand, the more helpful it is to the study of politics. The more clearly you define what it is you're discussing, things, whether it be social issues or economic issues, the easier it's going to be to to compare between various countries and see which one has a more effective economic system or a more effective social system. It also is important to study the comparative politics to look at the different systems. In other words, you can't make a theory or hypothesis, which means really an educated guess, about political systems if you know nothing about it. So you also need to be able to describe the political system. So, again, all of these things, it's not really critical that you memorize these because they're all quite logical. In order to compare different political systems, you need to be able to describe what you are comparing succinctly and accurately. You need to be able to understand the bases of those systems and, of course, how they operate. We also use causal relationships. In other words, we try to look at figuring out what the cause of a particular phenomenon is. For example, we might say, well, this country doesn't have a free market, and therefore this country's GDP is really low. Or this country cares a lot about social issues, and therefore this country doesn't allow certain types of immoral behavior. Again, these are all things that are important in studying comparative politics. You say, if this country, for example, subscribes more to this religion, so maybe because of that, the precepts of that religion will have more of an impact on its government and its laws. Okay, and then of course you have to look at the performance. Okay, we know what the theory behind that government is, but how has that government actually performed? How has the government made use of its resources? A country could have a tremendous amount of oil or a tremendous amount of educated manpower or a tremendous amount of whatever natural resource there is. How good has the political system been in making sure that these things are taken advantage of? Just to give you a simple example, if there's a lot of oil in the ground, but the country doesn't allow it to be drilled, or the country doesn't make any economic incentives for people to drill the oil. If the government says, for example, we control everything, and if you drill and you get the oil, you don't get to keep any of it, well, then maybe the government is not very good at extracting its own resources. How good has the government distributed its benefits or services? Or how good is society at distributing its benefits or services? Does all the good of the society that it produces go to a few rich people, or is it spread well among the entire society? That's an important thing. What kind of behavioral regulations are there? In other words, how strict are the rules? Are there symbolic acts that are done by the government that indicate a particular philosophy? Again, these are all things that contribute to the evaluation of the performance of a government. And of course, you have to realize that the outcome is never completely in the hands of the people. There could be a lot of luck, and there could be a lot of other policies of other countries that cause things to change. So you can't assume that just because a government does a good job of one particular thing that it's automatically going to work. Just to give you an example, there was a few years ago There was a scare about mad cow disease, and because of that, some countries weren't importing beef from other countries. So if I had a country that exported a lot of beef to the United States and made a tremendous amount of money, and I was doing really well, and had fantastic government policies, but then there was this mad cow disease, and the U.S. stopped importing my beef, well then that's going to hurt me. And even though I didn't do anything wrong, and I didn't, all my policies were working properly, it's just some sort of external factor or luck or a different country deciding to do something differently that was going to cause the policy performance to be very poor in this case. Next, let us look at political culture. Political culture is how the people in a country look at their own government and look at their own political system. And political socialization, which again, social comes from basically meaning people, where how do the people interact and participate in the government. So the political culture means the public attitudes toward politics and the role within the political system. That doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as the attitude towards a particular politician or towards Congress. It means to the government and the government system as well. The three basic levels of political culture are system-wide, and these are some of the things that can indicate what the political culture is. How much national pride is there? Are people proud to be Americans, or proud to be French, or proud to be Israeli? Do people identify with a particular country? Do people call themselves Americans? Do they say, well, I'm just a regular white guy, or Jew, or Hispanic, or whatever? Do they identify themselves with the United States? Legitimacy in government. Do people agree that their government is legitimate, or do they think that their government are usurpers and illegitimate? Process. The political culture also takes a look at what kind of role in the political system do the regular people play. Are there political rights? What do the people do as part of the political system? What are the expectations in terms of how the politics should function? Do people have high expectations for their government, or do people assume that their government are going to be ineffective? What is the individual's relationship? Do people get involved in politics? What's sometimes known as the grassroots. Sometimes you'll hear a politician say, well, mine is a grassroots campaign. What they mean is that a bunch of people that are not necessarily the rich or the movers and shakers are getting involved in their campaign and want them to win. You heard President Obama, for example, always say, mine is grassroots, grassroots, grassroots. What he was trying to say is that his campaign is not governed by huge interests, but rather by private individuals who want to get involved in the political system. And of course, you also want to look at the policy. What does the government actually do? What is their role? What are their priorities? What does the government do things that are necessary for the people? Does it do things that the people disagree with? What are the people? What is the government? How responsive is the government to the needs of the people? That certainly is an important aspect of political culture that cannot be overlooked. And then within the political culture, you have the political subculture. In other words, within the political culture, you've got subcultures. Political subcultures include things upon which there's disagreements or problems within the political culture, and of course, these are things that have to be dealt with. For example, you have sharply different points of view on critical political matters between different people within the country, which again is fine. This is a perfectly natural component of any political culture, are these undercurrents, these political subcultures that may differ from the overriding political culture. Also, groups demand equal treatment. There may be disadvantaged minorities that, as they grow in their power, they demand equal treatment. These are again groups that are within the dominant culture, but may have some sort of a different interest than most other people, and different cultural paths based on ethnicity, different religion, different language. People that speak Spanish, people that are Jewish, people that are black, people that have different subcultures, people that are a little bit different for whatever reason than the main culture. They also have their own private interests that they want to make sure are protected. And of course, subcultures often develop in a country deeply divided in its political issues with differences persisting over time. People who have different uh, agendas might have or that are from different groups might have different agendas. They might think that different types of issues are important. Maybe they think security is more important. Maybe they think social welfare is more important. Maybe they think freedom of religion is the most important thing. So political subcultures are groups within the dominant race, in other words, within the country, that are different because of their religion, different because of their race, different because of their viewpoints, different because of whatever reason, but that may have different interests from the majority. Next, we have the system itself. System levels is the idea that a political system needs the support of its citizens in order to have legitimacy. Now, obviously, if you're a dictator or a totalitarian regime, you need a lot less of the support of your people, but still, ultimately, all governments depend to one degree or another on legitimacy, the fact that the people think they're legitimate. Where there's high legitimacy, people are more likely to obey the law rather than trying to get around it with things like the black market and cheating the government if they think they can get away with it. Where there's low legitimacy, of course, people are much more likely to resort to theft and violence and things like that to solve political differences between the people. There's also, of course, political socialization, and again, we've discussed this also a little bit. Political socialization is the relationship between the people and its government. So this refers to the way political values are formed and political culture is transmitted from one generation to the next. Do parents and teachers teach their children that the government is a good form of government, that is legitimate, that it needs to be listened to, or that it is an army of occupation that must be fought? That's an important distinction. What causes the socialization of the government? What causes the socialization of the political system? Well, individuals obviously teaching each other, organizations like educational organizations, institutions that influence political attitudes like political action committees and things like that, including, of course, things like family, schools, friends, political parties. Of course, these determine what other people, what children and other people, let's say, that are watching the media learn about their political system, so that they have an important element or an important role in political socialization. The trends regarding contemporary political cultures, which means the trends that governments seem to be leaning towards in today's day and age, we've got three of them. One is democratization, which means that countries are becoming more and more democratic, which means less and less authoritarian, less and less fascist, less and less dictatorship-like, more and more like democracies. Modernization has that should be eroded, which means taken apart, taken off, or decreased acceptability of non-democratic ideologies. In other words, today, because everybody's more modernized and they've got more access to information, the legitimacy of dictators and people who don't listen to the people has been seriously undermined, seriously decreased, excuse me. Then you have marketization. Marketization, of course, means the idea that the market has permeated the world. Economic markets have there's been increased acceptance of free market over government control of the economy. Companies are basically allowed to make whatever profit they can make in the system. The governments Traditionally, there were other types of governments like communism, socialism, that limited profits or that wanted all people to be equal by government rule, by government direction. But today, generally speaking, most countries have gone more towards the free market, which means let people go ahead and try to make as much money as they can, as opposed to being communists where everybody makes the same amounts. And of course, you have another important point, and that is globalization. Globalization is the idea that countries are more independent on each other. Rather than manufacturing everything in the United States, we import stuff from China and Korea and Taiwan and places like that, and we exports things like computer technology, information technology, things like that. Globalization means the more and more interdependence, international interactions between people of different countries and between economic systems of different countries. And of course, there's been an increase in respect for human rights, gender equality, in other words, treatment of women, democratic values, because different people are exposed to these ideas, whereas in the past, when there wasn't so much information out there, people didn't realize that there were countries in the world where men and women were treated equally, etc., etc. Next, we're going to look at interest aggregation and political parties. A little bit of an unwieldy title. Interest aggregation means the combining of various interests. If there's a whole bunch of people who have a similar interest and they get together to vote for a person or to support a political cause, they are aggregating, which means getting together, their interests. How do they aggregate their interests? How do many people with similar agendas or similar desires aggregate their interests, get together their interests? The answer is they form political parties. And those political parties then go ahead and try to do what their constituents, which means the people that voted for them and the people that appointed them, want them to do. So political parties, really what they are groups or organizations that seek to put candidates in office under their label. Republican, Democrat, Independent, Conservative, whatever. The point of the political parties, their goal, is to mobilize, which means to gather, support for policies and candidates, especially related to interest aggregation. In other words, a bunch of people decide together that they want to have very strong security and or very certain policies on the Middle East or whatever, and then they go ahead and they form a political party, they form a group, and then they try to put candidates in office who believe as they do, and they vote for them, try to get other people to vote for them, donate money to them, etc. You could also have political parties that are founded outside the government. You could have political parties that are founded by the quote-unquote grassroots, by people who don't have political connections. Either one is, of course, equally valid. You can also have an internally created political party that's founded by government office holders. That happens in Israel a lot, for example. I remember the Kadima party, which Ariel Sharon belonged to, was born out of the Likud party when Sharon wanted to change a little bit about the way Likud was doing things, so they formed a new political party. This sort of thing happens in Israel all the time. In the United States, it doesn't happen quite as much, but it still certainly can happen. And the point of political parties, the point of politics in general, is to establish and to support policies. That's the root of the word politics. Policy is something that the government establishes as a mechanism by which the government or some sort of law is going to run. So political parties can be made by anyone. Policies can be made by anyone, whether a voter or a party activist can establish a policy. Of course, it doesn't matter what the policy is unless it's actually passed into law. But in terms of establishing the policy in the first place or bringing up the policy, suggesting a policy, certainly that's something that anybody can do. Some policies are more radical, in other words, more extreme, more outside the mainstream. Very often these are things that are advocated by party activists. If you have a very conservative party, if you have, let's say, the Republicans, very strong Republicans might want to adopt very strongly conservative policies. Whereas the ones that usually win out, the ones that the voters usually prefer, are kind of towards the middle, a little bit more moderate. Now, what we have in the United States system, now, okay, this slide is really just about competitive party systems. In other words, what kind of party systems do different governments have? Now, this varies dramatically from country to country. For example, you have two-party systems, which is what we have in the United States, which are dominated by two parties. In our country, that happens to be the Democrats and the Republicans. They have the power and authority to make the government policy when they're in the majority. When the Democrats win, they control. When the Republicans win, they control. But again, both parties certainly have a lot of influence. You also have some examples where you have two dominant parties, but you also have minor parties that kind of swing the balance, like in Britain, where you have the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, the Tories. And they're also minor parties, but those are usually one out of those two are going to be the one in charge. You also have coalition systems, like they have in Israel, where you have a competitive multi-party system. In other words, you have many different parties that are going to be part of the government, and they establish pre-electoral coalitions, so voters know which parties will work together to form the government. Like in Israel, for example, you need to have a coalition of parties that equal 61 seats altogether in order to form a government. That might be, the Likud party and the Bayit Yehudi party and the what do they have now? Now it's the Yesh Atid party and a few other parties that form the coalition. But again, that can change dramatically. That's just another form of democracy where instead of having two dominant parties, you have a bunch of little parties, and these parties have to come together to form a coalition, which is like an alliance where you have a majority of the government that agrees to certain basic principles. And you also have multi-party systems where you don't even need a coalition, where all you need to do is have nobody has a majority. Every law and every election is just done independently. If you had the Israeli system without a coalition and you just had every party voted their own way on every vote, it would be a little bit more chaotic. But that's also certainly a possible system. And within the party systems, you have different types of party systems. Again, these are all just possibilities. They're fairly apparent. There's the consensual party system, where the parties basically agree with each other. You can even argue that the American system is like that, where the Democratic Party and the Republican Party love to fight, but on many issues, especially on economic issues, they're not really that far apart on many issues. You have the conflictual party system, where parties are far apart on policies and hate each other's guts, like maybe also like the American system in certain ways, where the Democrats and Republican parties conflict with each other. This, of course, can also lead to system failure, policy gridlock, which means where nothing gets passed, separatist politics, where political parties try to distinguish themselves, and power struggles. And I guess this one is something similar to what we have in the United States today, where the Democrats and Republicans try to torpedo each other's ideas. So interestingly enough, we have a system in the U.S. where the parties really aren't that far apart, but they hate each other so much that it causes gridlock. Okay, you have the consociational party system, which is really where parties are far apart, but I guess they have to compromise at one point or another. But again, these are just possibilities. The next thing, this Duverger's law, it's not really a law, it's kind of a principle, and the principle is the reason why countries like the United States remain as two-party systems. Because the United States has districts, rather than having, for example, like they do in Israel, where everybody gets seats in the Knesset based on the percentage of votes that they got. If you get 10% of the votes, you get about 10% of the seats in the Knesset. It's not the way it works in the United States. The United States has districts, and whoever wins the district wins the entire congressional seat for that district. You get 40%, you get 30%, you get 20%. It doesn't help you. Unless you're the winner of that particular district. And with that sort of rule, in other words, the single-member district system, first of all, third parties don't win, because these third parties, if they're not going to get enough votes, if they're not going to win, there's no point in people voting for them. In other words, if I want to vote for a third party, but I realize there's only two major parties and this third party doesn't have a chance to win anyway, instead of voting for the third party, I'm just going to vote for one of the two majors because I want to at least have my vote count. I want my vote to go towards a party that has a chance to win. So, first of all, you have a psychological effect. Voters anticipate the fact that one of the two parties is gonna win, so they don't bother supporting the third party very strongly. And second of all, you have strategic voting. Even if I want to vote for, let's say, for example, the Conservative Party, but I think, hey, the Conservative Party has no chance, I might as well vote for the party that's close to the Conservative Party, let's say, for example, the Republican Party. So I would vote for the Republican Party even though I don't necessarily like them, because I like them better than the alternative. It's the lesser of two evils. So if you have a situation where each party, only one person wins from each district, that tends to establish two-party systems. And finally, we have the issue of the military. The military is a little bit of a different element in a democracy like the United States. The famous military-industrial complex. The military certainly has a lot of influence over the government. So the military has instruments of force and organizational capacity. The military can enforce policy on other countries, and of course even within your own country. And military forces can sometimes, because of that, become leaders of the government. Now, in the United States, of course, we have had former generals become presidents, like George Washington and Dwight Eisenhower, just to name a couple. And there were several others as well, William Henry Harrison and others as well, but at least they're elected. In many countries, especially developing countries, countries that may not have the same level of democracy, the same level, and they may have military strongmen taking over the country. And of course, that's really not a good thing for democracy. So military forces as leaders of the government can be harmful because the military has a monopoly, which means they have control over powerful forces. And the army is not designed for interest aggregation. In other words, the military is not designed to get people elected to serve their constituents. The military is designed by force, and that's why there's a major problem with the military controlling government, because the military isn't designed to serve its constituents. The military is designed really more to rule by force. And countries sometimes do turn to military governments. Countries, again, especially countries going through very tough situations. First of all, because military governments get things done quickly and efficiently, and rather than politics, which have to rather than Congress, which has to debate bills for days and days, the military can just do it and doesn't care what anybody else thinks. And also, military governments don't need to compromise or sell their message to the people, so they don't have to compromise and be all spend money on advertisements and run public relations campaign. They can just do it. So what's the problem with militaries? Obviously, the problem is they could become totalitarian. They could violate civil rights and not let people certain freedoms that people should have. But of course, the other side of the coin is that military governments are very unstable. And the reason why they're very unstable is because they are not necessarily supported by a majority of the people. Governments like in the United States, democracies, if there's somebody elected, so it usually means that person was voted in by a majority of the people. Governments that take over other countries, countries like Haiti and certain African countries, that when the government takes over, you have the government that's not supported by the majority of the people. So therefore, if you have another group within the military or another part of the government that tries to overthrow them, tries to run a coup to overthrow the government, they don't really have the support of the people to fall back on. So military governments are not really consistent with democracy, and they don't really do a good job of representing their constituents, of representing the people. However, countries do turn to military governments sometimes. People do turn to military governments because they have the ability to get things done quickly, but they're also unstable. In other words, they can be overthrown much easier than a democratically elected government can be overthrown because they don't have popular support. Next, we are going to look at government and policymaking. In other words, how does a government operate to set policy? Well, the first thing is that in countries in which they exist, a constitution is the basic document under which the entire government operates. It establishes the rules of decision making, for example, it sets up Congress's role and the president's role, the court's role, etc. It also establishes basic rights, like our Bill of Rights, which establishes our freedom of speech, freedom of religion, certain rights of criminals to have fair trials, etc. And it distributes authority. It says which parts of the government, which offices have which authorities. They're usually written documents. Not all countries have written constitutions. For example, Israel, for example, has no written constitution. Even England doesn't have a written constitution. And when there is civil upheaval, like some sort of a revolution, and a new government takes over, or like a military government or whatever it is, one of the first things they very often do is either change the constitution, write a new constitution, or even, throw out a constitution. Of course, a constitution can be amended, which means changed. from time to time, and the ways in which a constitution can be changed are usually spelled out in the document. And for example, the United States' Constitution has been amended 27 times. The first 10 were the Bill of Rights, and then it's been amended 17 times since in the last 225 years. One example over here, the 26th Amendment, was where the voting age in the U.S. used to be 21, and now it's 18. And one of the reasons behind that rule was that people who were 18 could be drafted, and so therefore people thought it made sense that if you're old enough to be drafted, you're old enough to vote. The slogan, I think, for the 26th Amendment was, "Old enough to die, old enough to vote." And the rules can be amended to accommodate new or internal or external powers. If a country gets conquered or a country changes its mind about something, it can amend its constitution upon which the entire government is based to reflect this new reality. So, let's take a look at how governments distribute the power. Now, obviously, this would be based on the Constitution. But there are many different types of governments within a constitution. You have the idea of confederalism. Confederalism means most of the power is held by the states. A classic example was the United States under the Articles of Confederation, which was back from 1781 until about 1787 or so, when the new constitution was done. So just for a few years, but in that situation you had a very weak central government, and the states retained most of their power. Then you have a concept called federalism, which is really what we have today, where we have most power applies to the central government, the federal government, but you also have power that is in the states. In the US, for example, you have the central federal government with its power, but you also have some power that's distributed to each of the 50 states. Really, you have 51 different governments in the US. You have a central government, and you have the governments of all 50 states. Splitting this power between the states and the federal government is called federalism. There are many advantages to federalism, which means splitting up the power. There are two. Well, I guess this has nothing to do with the line just above it. But anyway, in the United States government, you have the two chambers in the legislature. In other words, our Congress has two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate, based on population and geography. The Senate, for example, has two senators from each state, whereas the House of Representatives has 435 districts from throughout the country. Really, the connection between this and federalism is that one of the principles upon which our government is based is the splitting of power. Splitting of power between the federal and the state governments, and even within the federal government, splitting the power between the executive and the legislative and the judicial branches, which means the presidency, Congress, and the courts, and even within the legislative branch, within the lawmaking branch, within Congress, of splitting it again into a House of Representatives and a Senate. And of course, another of the advantages of federalism, splitting the power between the states and the federal government, is that the federal government doesn't have to make laws that are relevant to each state. It just makes laws that are relevant to the entire country. And then you could have states like Montana, Wyoming, Texas, California. They can experiment with their own rules that are most relevant and important to their particular people. It also helps protect ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities rather than consolidating the government in one big, central, powerful structure run by the minority. The representatives of the various states can have their own smaller governments where minorities can have a bigger stake in it. It also serves as a check on ambitious rulers and protects freedoms, the fact that you don't have all the power that are consolidated in one central apparatus. Instead, you have power that's split among many different entities. The opposite type of government is the unitary government, where the entire state, in this case state means country, like England, France would be a state. I know in the US we call states parts of the country, but in most countries the state really means the entire country. So in a unitary government, which includes most countries today, including countries like Britain, France, Japan, Iran, many others, most others probably, Israel including as well. You have one central government, and you have also smaller subnational divisions, provinces, cities. You have all of those smaller governments as well, but they all derive their power from the central government. For example, if you look at Israel, you have a mayor of Yerushalayim, but the mayor of Yerushalayim and the city council of Yerushalayim only derives whatever power is given to it by the central government. If the central government of Israel wants to change the power of the city of Yerushalayim, it can pretty much do that. In the U.S., it's a little different. We have federalism where the government, the federal government, the central government, cannot take away the power of the individual states. In a unitary government, they can. Now let's look at the branches of government and how they operate a little bit more. A legislature is a part of the government that makes the law. In the US, they call that Congress. In England and in Israel, for example, they call that Parliament. Sometimes Parliament only has one house. That is called a unicameral legislature. In Israel, for example, there's the Knesset, and that's pretty much it. That is it, as a matter of fact. That's called a unicameral legislature. There's only one house. You can also have a bicameral legislature, which means the legislature, the rulemaking authority, has two houses. The US has that, the Senate and the House of Representatives. The United Kingdom, Britain has that. That's the House of Lords and the House of Commons. That's called a bicameral legislature. Then you also have the executive branch and the chief executive. In the United States, of course, that is the president. In other countries like Israel and England, that would be considered the prime minister. The executive branch, namely the branch of government that enforces the rules and really governs the country on a day-to-day basis, is the largest, most complex, and most powerful branch of government. So the role of chief executive is the head of the government, like the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of England, the Prime Minister of Israel, who runs the country on a day-to-day basis, has power in terms of, like, for example, just to give you an example, the U.S. President is in charge of all the federal prosecutors, is in charge of the IRS, is in charge of the Food and Drug Administration, the TSA. All the administrative agencies report to the President, so the President really has a tremendous amount of power. A chief executive can also be the quote-unquote head of state, which is a ceremonial post that doesn't come with any real power. In the U.S., it's combined. In the U.S., the head of state, namely the person who represents the country, is the same person that's the head of the government, and that, of course, is the President of the United States. In other countries, like England and again Israel, they split it, where in England, the British Prime Minister is the head of government, while the Queen, or eventually if she dies, then it would be a king, would be the head of state. In Israel, you have the same thing. In Israel, you have two different people, one who's the Prime Minister and one who's the President. The President is the ceremonial head, the public face of the country, but the Prime Minister is the person that really controls the government and really has the power. What does the executive do? And again, you're talking about the President or the Prime Minister in countries that have a parliamentary system. So part of the responsibility is to consult with the legislature, which means work with the legislature to try to help decide what laws are going to be passed. Certainly the presidential administration in the U.S. has a lot of say in terms of what Congress does. So that's one important thing. Establishing a climate of trust and confidence in the political system, although of course that's not always clear whether it works, but certainly the executive should try to do that. Carrying out policy, that's a big one. The U.S. president decides or rules over people like the federal prosecutor's offices, and has a say in how the rules are enforced. As head of all the administrative agencies, as head of the government employees. Initiating new policies, the president or the prime minister can sometimes decide. They can't pass their own laws, but what they can do is they can set policy. And certainly you see that happening in the United States a lot. Improving performance in various sectors, in other words, trying to think of ways to make the country more efficient. Recruitment, to recruit other people to the government to try to get help with enacting various policies, and may also, like the president has, have veto powers, where the president can say, even if Congress passes a law, the president can say, I don't want to sign it, and therefore it does not become law. That is called veto, where the president vetoes, which means in Latin, forbid. I forbid this law from becoming law. When Congress passes a bill, it has to go to the president. If the president signs it, it becomes law. If the president doesn't sign it, well, then it becomes vetoed. Now, Congress can override the veto with a 2/3 majority, but again, that's a little bit beyond the scope of what you need to know. What are political elites? Political elites are people who have political power. How do they get that political power? Obviously, they could become elected to it. They could become involved in political parties. They could become the head of, for example, the Democratic National Committee or the Republican National Committee, or state committees or local committees. And so the political elites are really people who kind of control the political machine. It's not necessarily done by gender or class or age. You don't have to be a particular gender or a particular class of wealth or a particular age. Really, anybody could theoretically rise up to the point where they become a political elite and have a lot of political power. So certainly it could be really anybody. And of course, the challenge of a society is to make sure that these people, the elites, don't become elitist or authoritarian, which means they don't try to control people in a non-democratic way. If you had a few people get to the top and then they ran the entire government in a non-democratic way, then you'd have what is called an oligarchy. Oligarchy means the rule of a few people. But if you have a good democratic system where their powers, the people in charge, their powers are checked by other people in power, so then hopefully you keep them from gaining too much power. In fact, democracies are set up specifically so that this shouldn't happen. And obviously, the thing that helps with this is having periodic competitive elections. The more elections you have, the harder it is for anybody to gain a large amount of personal power. You also have impeachment and executive removal. If a president starts committing crimes and gets too full of himself or goes over the top, then the president can be impeached by Congress. And also the president can remove other officers, like heads of ambassadors, heads of administrative agencies. If President Obama feels that the head of the IRS has become politically corrupt, the president can remove him or her. So that's one mechanism by which the U.S. and democracies in general try to make sure that these political elites do not become too powerful.